Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we're going to be looking into the English styles. And I just want to give you a fair warning. This lecture is going to be pretty long, but I will give you plenty of opportunities to pause it. Do not feel like you need to watch this all at once. It can actually pretty easily be broken into parts. It's just the way that PowerPoint has me record. I need to be able to do it all on one pass. But like I said, I'll definitely tell you when you can go ahead and pause it. So, England is going to be an incredibly influential place, not necessarily for the vast majority of their history, but especially from Renaissance into modern history. As we can see on the quote here, it says that as the Roman nation was to antiquity, so the British nation is to modern history, and most of this has to do with their colonization efforts. Which didn't always bring kindness to certain countries, but definitely expanded the reach of the British Empire. So now we're going to take a look at a map. You can see that England is actually going to be right around here. Though they did have a lot of influence over Great Britain as a whole, though it wasn't unified at this time period. All right, so now we're going to look at the background, specifically the geography of Great Britain. So first thing you'll notice is since it is an island, it is isolated and not often invaded. However, that also means that it takes ideas longer to get to England just because it is so isolated. Therefore, it got behind the times. The Renaissance ended up reaching England about 100 years after it was popular in Italy. So, like I said, while it's great for invasions, that isolation does hinder them in some aspects. They were a seafaring group of people, specifically looking at John and Sebastian Cabot, as well as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, who will eventually settle in Virginia. There are some national disasters. So in 1066, William the Conqueror manages to invade, and that's the only successful time that we know of that England has actually been invaded. And then we also see in 1666 the Great Fire of London, which is going to destroy many of their buildings and hurt many people. So the people of England were quite homogenous. They definitely had similar values, similar looks, everything about them, like I said, was a pretty homogenous culture. It's not like what we've seen in Greece that was pretty diverse. They built a lot of country estates and manors. They definitely had a very strong tie to the feudal system, which once again leaves some people wealthy while others live below the poverty line. Their values were honor, liberty, independence, law, loyalty. And so you can see this in a lot of their personal aspects. They also loved tradition and the past. They made their history a part of who they are, and it's very ingrained in their society. They also loved the outdoors and sportsmanship, despite the fact that the outdoors are often rainy and not necessarily the ideal for you to play outdoors. They would rather argue than fight, and they loved theater and literature. So you're going to have Shakespeare and then like Mary Shelley and some of the other really influential authors come out of England. The styles are often copied, and the literature and gardening, however, is original to England. So, like I said, most of these styles we're actually going to notice and recognize a lot, whether it is left over from the Gothic period, which we've already talked about in England, or whether it is coming in from Italy or elsewhere. So, like I said, they were incredibly influential. They were also influenced by a lot. So we're going to see a lot of similarities between these styles and other styles that we have previously studied. So moving on to an overview of the time periods that we're going to look at. First, we're going to have the early Renaissance. And one thing that's really critical to understanding how we comprehend the styles of England, everything is tied to a ruler. So you're going to see the Tudor style is tied to Henry VIII, the Elizabethan style tied to Elizabeth I, the Jacobean style tied to James I, and the Cromwellian style is dedicated to Cromwell. Then you have the Middle Renaissance, which follows the Restoration after that Great Fire in 1666. Then we're going to have the William and Mary style, the Queen Anne style, and the early Georgian style. And then in the late Renaissance, we're going to see the Middle Georgian and late Georgian styles, as well as the Regency and Victorian styles. The other way in which we look at the periods of English styles is through the type of wood used. So in different time periods, different types of wood were popularized in terms of building their furniture and decorative elements. So the age of oak starts with the Tudor time period. The age of walnut starts with William and Mary. And then the age of mahogany starts with Queen Anne, and lastly, the age of satinwood starts with the late Georgian period. So this slide, you're going to see what we talked about in our first overview of the periods. So you can see the breakdown once again showing the early Renaissance with the Tudor, Elizabethan, Jacobean, and Cromwellian. But now you can see which woods are tied to each of these. So like Queen Anne starts mahogany, late Georgian starts satinwood, William and Mary starts walnut, and oak is used throughout the early Renaissance all the way through the Restoration. All right, so now we're going to look at an overview of the periods and the monarchs that ruled within them. So the Tudor style lasts for several rulers. You see that with Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Queen Mary. In the Elizabethan style, we're only going to see that last through Elizabeth I. But this was the golden age for England. It was incredibly peaceful, and they increased a lot of their wealth and gained a lot of prosperity. The Jacobean style is congruent with James I, who brought the Renaissance to England and follows until Charles I. The Cromwellian style does not have a monarch, as General Cromwell was the one that was in charge, so the monarchy kind of falls out of the picture for a minute, and then we're going to see it come back in the Restoration. However, this was a period of great unrest. You had the Puritans, and the art was mostly banned, so we're going to see some design elements, but ultimately not that much was going on in terms of creating things at that point in time, as they were still trying to deal with all of the unrest that was going on. So following the Cromwellian period, which is the last of the early Renaissance, we see the Great Fire of London in 1666, which leads us into the Middle Renaissance. This starts with the Restoration period, as Charles II is able to restore the monarchy, and he is the cousin of Louis XIV in France. So we're going to see a lot of similarities between the two styles. James II would also be a ruler during the Restoration period, but he is eventually ousted. Then we have the William and Mary style, which follows in the design style of William of Holland and his wife Mary, who is the daughter of James II. This time period had a lot of prosperity, though it was rather simple, so they really valued that simplicity. Then we have the Queen Anne style, which is associated with the rule of George I. As he expanded the empire, and this brought about a lot of new thinking, a lot of culture, as well as a lot of comfort. So they really started to value comfortable elements in their home after seeing other cultures in the world and how they decorated their spaces. Then we have the early Georgian period, which is once again associated with George I, but we see in this period the loss of the American colonies. So this is going to be after America declares for independence. But we also see a lot of great industrial change, which makes it much easier to build certain types of furniture, right? So this is leading into that industrial revolution. So next we're going to look at the late Georgian period. So you start that with the middle Georgian, which is associated with George II. And there's a lot of trade going on there. And then in the late Georgian, so associated with George III, you have Pompeii being discovered. So we're going to see, just like we saw in France, a lot of influence from the discovery of Pompeii bleeding into the architectural and interior stylings of England during that time period. Then we have the Regency period. So that's when George IV became regent as George III was ill. And they eventually defeated Napoleon in 1810. This is post-industrial revolution, so we're seeing large factories, and they tended to rebel against manners. Then we have the Victorian style, which is going to be the last that we will look at in this lecture, and that is associated with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. It really settled people and restored social norms after so much change had been happening in the world between the colonization periods and then the Industrial Revolution. Now we've reached it. This is the industrial age. Everything's being able to be built so much faster. And so there's a lot of eclecticism involved with that, but craftsmanship would ultimately decline. As with any industrial age, and as we've seen in other aspects of our lives, the more industrial something becomes, the more mass-produced it is, the more mass-produced it becomes, and then we see that decline in individual craftsmanship that we had seen for centuries up until this point. So this slide might be one worth screenshotting. It gives you a timeline of each of the styles as well as the type of wood used, the monarch they're associated with, the style that we associate them with, any other important figures of the time, as well as the different stylistic elements that are going to be seen in this last column. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the early Renaissance, which is the Tudor period. So King Henry VIII was aware of England's lad. Spain was under Ferdinand, and it was becoming a great power in the New World. And then France was under Francis I, and it was also becoming a political and cultural power. And if you remember, King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, they're going to be the ones that set up a lot of colonies in that Latin America section of the New World. They're going to be gaining riches at a rate faster than we see any other country growing at this point. And so Henry is very much aware that he is lagging behind that. Therefore, he strove to improve court life. And he invited artists from other countries to work in England. This is a portrait of Henry VIII, so not the best looking, but you can see that he definitely invested in artwork and in the finest fabrics and finishes in the rooms around him, once again trying to prove his richness. On this slide, you can see a breakdown of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and this is going to be critically important to our understanding of English culture, as well as the need for divorce ends up becoming one of the prime reasons for the foundation of the Church of England. So when England splits from that Catholic Church and leans into Protestant ideals instead of Catholic ones, part of that is due to Henry's want to divorce some of his wives. So first you have Catherine of Aragon, who is the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And so that's super important because it does give England a relationship with Spain at this time. Then you have Anne Boleyn, who was one of Catherine's ladies in waiting. And then you have Jane Seymour. So this is after Anne Boleyn is executed. She was famously beheaded. He went on to marry Jane, and then she ended up dying during childbirth, but she was the only one who was able to give Henry VIII a son, which is once again one of the most important roles of a monarch at this time, to create an heir. Then you have Anne of Cleves, and she did not last very long. However, she was very wealthy and rich and influential in her own right. She didn't necessarily need Henry's money or anything like that, so she ended up being just fine. Then you have Catherine Howard, and she would also be beheaded. And then lastly, you have Catherine Parr. And so Catherine Parr was actually once again an influential figure in her own right. She really fought for women's abilities to study scripture rather than leaving that work solely to the men. And so her writings are actually quite famous on their own. So on this slide, you can see an image of Edward VI. He is King Henry VIII's only son. His mother is Jane Seymour, who, like I said, dies days after he's born. And Jane Seymour is largely considered to be the only wife that Henry ever loved. She was definitely his favorite, at least according to his writings and reports about him. He's also buried next to her. And they were married for only 15 months before she died. So now we're going to look at some of the architecture of the Tudor period. So the Tudor period falls between 1500 and 1558. There is a transition from the Gothic period, which had castles, to country manors. So Gothic is associated with the castles, country manors associated with the Tudor style. There is a gradual introduction of the Renaissance, so it comes very slowly, not all at once like we saw elsewhere. They have beautiful gardens and lawns, probably somewhat influenced by France in this aspect. They definitely also consider landscape architecture to be equally important to the actual architecture that's being built. We also see second floor overhangs become quite popular. So the second floor actually extends out past the first floor. They often have projecting windows, so windows that stick out further than the rest of the wall. We see a lot of L, E, and H-shaped floor plans. And then the Tudor arch ends up being developed during this time period, and they often relied on half-timber construction. So what you're seeing on this slide is an image of the daub and wattle walls, which are between the half-timber framing. So the wattle is the lath or foundation of the wall, which is often made of a woven framework of sapling and reeds. And then the daub is the plaster or the mud. So both of these elements would have gone in between the wood, which is the half-timber construction. And this is really synonymous with the Tudor style. It's definitely what we term as Tudor style. Even when it's built today, this look is still pretty popular in certain areas. But that's how they would have made it, with the framework being that wooden timber work and then having the wattle and daub in between. So this is Shakespeare's home. It's done in the Tudor style, and this is another really great example of the daub and wattle style. So you have the half timber where all of these wood framework pieces are, and then the wattle and daub where the plaster work is. You can also see a really great example here of the projecting windows. So that's what's going to be like this area where it actually projects outward, and you can even see it down here in some of these windows as well. But this house definitely fits all of the attributes of a Tudor style home. And this is just another image of that. Once again, you can see that half timber construction as well as the daub and wattle. And then you can see those projecting windows. And then you can also see this is a like modern landscape work, obviously, but you can still see that they cared for the gardens, even though this was more of a smaller, more cottage-like home. I mean, still very large for the time period, but in comparison to the castles and such that we'll see, this one's smaller. They still cared quite a bit about the detailing of the gardens around it. And then I think you can see it here, kind of that L or H or E shaped floor plan that's going on. So you definitely have a lot of right angles within the home. So another popular element of English buildings are the thatched roofs. So this cut thatch was sickle from the field. So these are the reeds kind of near ponds. These would have to dry for 3 months, and then you would start at the bottom of the roof and continue to build upwards. You would soak some of the reeds so that they can bend into a staple form and drive those in to hold the other reeds. Then you would use garden shears to trim the thatch, and then you would hide a pouch of coins in the thatch for the next thatcher to find. So coins from year of roof are the ones that are specifically put in that little pouch. And then you would write the thatcher's signature on the ridge board, which is the peak. And you can see that on this house. This is Anne Hathaway's house. You can see the very distinctive Tudor style, all of the projecting windows, that half timber construction, as well as that daub and wattle. But overall, you can just see how thick this roof would have to be because it is made out of those reeding elements. And so here you can see that up close. This one, it looks like has had some chicken wire on it to help preserve it. But essentially you would pack those reeds in as closely as possible and use the dried ones that had then been re-wet to kind of tie it together and to act as staples. And so once again, this is another view just so you can see how deeply and tightly packed these are. So on this side, you can see an image of the Hampton Court Palace, which was built in 1410. It was originally a monastery, and it ended up being the home of Henry VIII and many future kings and queens. You can see that it has a bright red brick that was either painted red or black. So this is a modern image of it. So it has actually been shifted and adjusted multiple times, but specifically when King William III eventually underwent a massive rebuilding and expansion project on this Hampton Court Palace. And that was intended to rival the Palace of Versailles, and this ended up destroying much of the Tudor palace. So his work would eventually cease in 1694, and it leaves the palace in two distinct contrasting architectural styles. Both the domestic Tudor and Baroque style can be seen here. So this is an image of the groundwork, and as I just mentioned, if this does remind you of Versailles, it absolutely should. All of these gardens were well planned out and had a specific purpose to really beautify the landscaping around the castle itself. Sorry, palace. And so, just as we saw in France, those in England would also be very worried with landscaping and making their palace look as good as they could from the outside. So this is an up-close view of that Hampton Court Palace, and there's a few key features that I want you to notice on here. So I'm going to circle them in blue. Here you can see the Tudor arch, so it still has that point at the top. However, it's much more flattened, so it's a flattened form of a Gothic arch. You can also see the quatrefoils and embattlements still being used, so those are once again left over from that Gothic period. And then lastly, note the projecting window, which was once again very popular during this time to have the window projecting outward a little bit. Outward a little bit. Now, the other thing that I want you to take note of is this brickwork that's happening on the edge here. That's known as a coin work, and so that would also become quite popular as a means of decoration. You'll note that unlike the Spanish styles, they're not using stucco to create this, and unlike some other styles, they're relying on like smaller bricks and a lot of mortar, similar to how we see a lot of construction happening in Texas today, actually. So it's not quite the same building materials just because of accessibility as we see in other areas of the world, such as France, such as Rome, and such as Greece. All right, so here you can see an image of a garden that's in the grounds of the Hampton Court Palace. And you'll just notice that it has a really clear line of symmetry going through it, but it's absolutely beautiful, especially at the time of year when this photo is taken. You can see all of the gorgeously colored flowers. But yes, once again, just like we saw in France, incredibly tailored gardens. Landscape architecture was very important to them. So one of the main features of the Hampton Court Palace is King Henry VIII's astronomical clock, which is on the inside. It still works even after all of these years. So that's a really important decorative element there, but you can also see the use of medallions throughout. And just because they were using brick to decorate doesn't mean that they were sacrificing any stylistic elements. Obviously, it looks different than the marble that we would see in Italy or elsewhere, but you'll notice that even using brick, they tried to add in these like diamond patterns or other elements in which they could decorate the space without having access to all of the same amounts of marble and fine finishings that we associate with other areas of the world. Lastly, you can also see in this image that Tudor arch once again. So you'll notice that it is a pointed arch still, but much more flat than we saw in the Gothic period. And then you can also see, just as we saw before, all of those embattlements, and just a lot of those key features from the Gothic period that are definitely filtering in to the Tudor period, but at the same time being interpreted or used or built in new ways. Okay, so now we're going to go over what the interiors would have looked like during that Tudor time period. So you're still going to see a lot of Gothic influence. This is coming off of the Gothic era. And just as a reminder, the English interpretation of Gothic is much more close to what we traditionally stereotype Gothic to be. It's darker, it's heavier, and very similar in many ways, but also different than what we saw in France. If you need a reminder about that, your Gothic lecture is back in Unit 1, and I would highly recommend you going through that one more time if you need to really nail down those elements a little bit better. So it does have a lot of Gothic influence. Like I said, it's very somber, very dark. They end up using a lot of wood, mostly because that's a material that is readily available for them. So they use that for wall panels and tall wainscots, as well as beamed ceiling and plank upper floors. Then we see the idea of great halls versus small rooms with flat ceilings. So they definitely implement a lot of great halls to give their spaces some grandeur. We also see Tudor kitchens become quite popular, specifically like the one in the Hampton Court Palace, which is actually located in the palace. So this is one of the first times throughout history that we're actually going to see kitchens integrated into the space. Usually they were a separate area, which is important when you consider that they didn't have ventilation in the same manner that we have it today. But then the Stratford-upon-Avon is also Shakespeare's house, and it's quite important in this time period as well. It influences a lot of other interiors. So here you can see an example of that hammer beam arch, which we have looked at once before in the Gothic period, and you can tell that it definitely relies on the use of a pointed arch while still maintaining a sort of quatrefoil shape. Trefoil shape, since there's only 3. So you have the 1, 2, and then 3. But you can also see in this specific drawing how you have a lot of Gothic ornament being used as well. So now we're going to look at the Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace. This is the largest room, and you can see that hammer beam ceiling that increased in span. So it's much wider and a lot more broad than we would have seen in the Gothic period, though we did see the same sort of truss system used there as well. There is a vent in the middle of the roof, which is really important. Remember, they didn't have electricity, so they were relying on candles and other forms of fire to provide both light and heat. Therefore, trying to add a vent to the room is incredibly beneficial. And so then we also see that Henry VIII could eat here with about 600 of his men, though that would require 2 sittings. And then this room also houses the arms of Henry VIII, Cardinal Wolsey, and all 6 wives can be seen in the stained glass here. So on this slide, you see an image of an interior detail at Hampton Court Palace. So you'll notice the use of the Tudor arch both above the door and in the fireplace. You can also see the use of the linen fold woodwork here in the wall paneling. And then you can also see art details of Henry's ventures. Alright, so here you're seeing an interior view of the Great Watching Chamber at Hampton Court Palace. This houses the arms of Henry VIII as well as Jane Seymour. And you'll notice the incredible detail work up on the ceiling, incredibly beautiful and detailed. And then also note the tapestries on the wall. Like I said, this served as insulation. It also would have mitigated sound. You can tell that this room is entirely full of hard surfaces, with the exception of those tapestries, so they would have definitely helped to absorb sound in a room this large. Fireplaces are also important, and then lastly, you'll note that this room is very light and bright in a way that's almost atypical of English design, and that's due to these clerestory windows up at the top. Due to the concern for fires, it wasn't common to have kitchens actually in the interior of the building. However, There are kitchens at Hampton Court. So you can see all of that here. You have a really large area as well as some space up here for storage. And they would have cooked all of the food here, so they would have had fires going in this space quite often. So moving on to talk about the furniture of the Tudor period, it was pretty sparse. There wasn't a lot of it, but we did see the wainscot chair. That remained quite popular. Most of it was made out of oak. Remember that we separate this sometimes into the types of wood that were popular, and oak was definitely the most popular during the Tudor period. Most everything was pretty rectangular in style. And then some of the popular pieces include cupboards, clothes press, chests, poster bed with testers, settles, and then we also see forms, and we use forms to mean two different things. So oftentimes we use them to mean stools, but we can also use that to mean like certain elements of a certain design, right? So there's a large bulbous form on the headboard of the bed or something like that. So don't get confused. We're going to use that term interchangeably, but I'll always make sure to tell you exactly what each piece is. So, like I said, most of these pieces of furniture should be pretty explainable. The cupboard stores things, as well as a clothes press and a chest, which would have been important for traveling. The poster beds with testers, those testers would have been the canopy area. The settle is like a table that can be folded up to turn into a bench, and then beneath the bench you actually have some storage, so that's helpful too. And then, like I said, furniture-wise, the forms we're going to talk about are usually stools of some sort. So here you can see an interior view of the page's chamber, which is next to that great watching chamber. Note the use of the Tudor arch in the fireplace, as well as the small medallion above it. This is a relatively simple room, but you can see some important pieces of furniture. You kind of have a cupboard back here in the back. And then these stools that you see here, we refer to those as forms. You can see the use of the turned leg as well as the low stretchers that connect all of the legs together. And these are going to be features that are pretty popular across the different types of furniture during the Tudor period. So this is the haunted gallery, which is assumed to be haunted by Catherine Howard. She was Henry's fifth wife, and she ended up being killed for having a relationship with someone else. You can see a lot of those same features that we have discussed before, really light and bright, thanks to the use of windows throughout. But you can also see the tapestries, a fireplace, which would have been important, and those forms, so those stools that you see there, and then the candelabras, which mimic the use of the turned leg that we see on most of the furniture. All right, so here you can see some more important pieces of furniture. This isn't exactly a four-poster bed, but it's pretty close. This one is actually an Elizabethan room, which is the birthplace of William Shakespeare. And so you can see still the use of the chest here, as well as the post on the bed. Generally, there would be four so that they could hold up a canopy, but obviously that's not part of this specific bed. You can also see that form happening here. And so, like I said, the furniture, it's generally dark and heavy thanks to it being made out of oak. But most everything they had was very useful to them in some way. They didn't have a lot of extraneous furniture. So on this slide, you can see an image of Queen Mary's bedchamber in Hampton Court Palace. Notice how elaborate the room is, really rich in both color, finishes, and stylistically, intended to show a lot of wealth, right? Now, One thing that you'll also notice is how large in scale some of this stuff is. Note that that fireplace is almost as tall as the person, as well as that bed being well taller than probably 3 or 4 times a person. So great dramatic amount of height there. And you can also see the wood paneling throughout, which we have discussed before. So very ornate, very elaborate, heavily decorated. All right, so now we're going to move on to talking about the ornament of the Tudor period. So one of the main things to note, this is actually a historical aspect, but it will change the ornament that we see, is that this was a time period right after the War of the Roses. So the War of the Roses were a series of bloody civil wars for the throne of England between two competing royal families, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. They were waged between 1455 and 1485, and it earned its name because of the white rose being the badge of the Yorks and the red rose being the badge of the Lancasters. After about 30 years of political manipulation and horrific carnage, as well as some brief periods of peace, the wars ended and a new royal dynasty emerged, and that's going to be the Tudor dynasty. And one of the ways that we see this symbolized is through the ornament of the rose motif. So naturally, the York house has that white motif, and the Lancaster house has the red rose motif. But the Tudors, when they come in, they are trying to bring a nation that has been warring for about 30 years into peace. So they're actually going to use a rose that has white and red elements to it. And we'll see that a little bit more on the next slide. But essentially, the tips of the rose's petals are red, while the inner portions are white. We also see that linen fold pattern, which I showed you a few slides back, and just remember that means that the wood has been carved to look like linen. The coat of arms is also quite important at this time, as well as arcaded panels. And those arcaded panels are intended to look like the arcades that we have seen in the past. Once again, this period was known for its use of oak, so you're going to see a lot of oak motifs, as well as portraits and arras tapestries. So on this slide, you can see the different types of roses used. On the left-hand side, you have the Lancaster rose. On the middle, you have the York rose. And on the right-hand side, you have the Tudor rose. So you can see that the Tudor rose really mixes elements of both, and would have definitely been a symbol that the new Tudor dynasty was aiming to unify both the House of Lancaster and the House of York. So this is Thomas Wolsey's closet that you can see in this image here. Notice all of the really intricate paneling as well as the detail on the ceiling. He was the Archbishop of York and he resided at Hampton Court. He was eventually forced to surrender ownership to Henry VIII. So remember, Henry VIII is going to be that Tudor king, that it is the War of the Roses is what ultimately pulls him into power. So he didn't necessarily have a direct line to the throne at the moment that he was born, but thanks to all of the political uncertainty surrounding him, he was able to eventually make his way to the throne. But once again, notice all of the really highly decorated aspects of this. You can see the Tudor arch still in the fireplace, as well as in that doorway. And then the portraiture that you can see on the walls as well. All right, so on this slide, you are seeing an image of a painting done by Girolamo da Trevesio. And this is titled A Protestant Allegory, sometimes referred to as the Four Evangelists Stoning the Pope. The subject refers to the English Reformation, formally sanctioned by the Act of Supremacy of 1534, whereby Henry VIII broke away from the Church of Rome and was established as the head of the Church of England. The painting was in the collection of Henry VIII, who owned at least two other anti-papal pictures. The composition comprises of a pope sprawling on the ground, flanked by two female figures representing avarice and hypocrisy, all of whom are being stoned by the four evangelists. On the ground in front of these figures are a cardinal's hat and a document with four seals. The city in the distance on the left may be Jerusalem. Above the city is a burning candle, which contrasts with another in the immediate foreground that had been extinguished by a cooking pan. The candles have been interpreted as symbolizing the relatively true light of the Gospels and the false doctrine of Rome. However, the Pope should be Paul III, but the depicted likeness is closer to Julius II. A specific identification may not have been intended. So just as a reminder, the English take a different route to the Protestant Reformation than we have looked at in the past, but they definitely very quickly become a Protestant nation due to the leadership of Henry VIII. So the last leader that we're going to look at during the Tudor time period is Queen Mary. And unlike Henry VIII, she actually wanted to reinstate Catholicism. Therefore, she definitely took sides against all of the Protestants. She would end up burning most of them at the stake at Oxford, or not most of them, just a fair bit. And this would earn her the nickname of Bloody Mary. So, just remember that this was a really tense time in England, and that doesn't necessarily justify what she did, but she was raised Catholic. She understood Catholicism, and then to see that split and fracture beneath her was probably really traumatic. So, therefore, she felt that the best way to lead England was to gain back the support of the church in Rome. Therefore, she definitely sided with Catholicism and was trying to enact it the way that the Pope had wished. All right, so now we're going to look at the Elizabethan period, which lasted from 1558 to 1603. The architecture featured multi-level buildings, and then we're also still going to see that projecting window known as an oriel, except that this one will have a corbel support. There are some architectural orders appearing as a transition to Renaissance continues, so we will get to see that Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian column being used once again. On the interiors, we're going to notice the pargework ceilings, which include relief carvings into the ceiling. And then for furniture, we're also going to see the use of the turned wood. So turned chairs, which feature a lot of spindles and such on that. And then you also have heavy, massive beds as well as cupboards. In terms of ornament, we will start to see some drop pendants become quite popular, and we'll look at all of this in just a minute. All right, so here's a portrait of Elizabeth I. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII, and she was a long-ruling queen of England, governing with relative stability and prosperity for 44 years. She claimed the throne at the age of 25 and held it until her death. She was born a princess but was declared illegitimate through a lot of political machinations. Um, but eventually, upon the death of her half sister Mary Tudor, she would take the crown. During her reign, Elizabeth I established Protestantism in England and defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. She maintained peace inside her previously divided country and created an environment where the arts flourished. She was sometimes called the Virgin Queen as she never married. So this is an example of an Elizabethan building, and you should notice right away that it looks quite a bit different from what we saw in the Tudor period. First and foremost, you don't see any of that half timber construction. This is all going to be brick and stone. And you'll also notice the use of the rounded arch rather than a Tudor arch. And then we also see the gabled roof being brought back. So it's not so flat anymore. Not that the ones in the Tudor were truly flattened roofs, but they were definitely not brought to points quite like these. You can see the use of square windows throughout or rectangular windows. And then they also might have had some stained glass in there as well. Once again, you can see the reintroduction of some orders being brought in. So like I said, still reviving elements that we have seen before. Nothing that you are seeing here is new. However, it's different than the way that we've seen it put together before, which makes the Elizabethan period quite unique in that regard. But also it's very different than what immediately preceded it. Alright, so if you can recall just a moment ago, I spoke with you that the furniture featured really heavy, massive beds as well as cupboards. Well, on this slide, you can see one of those massive beds. You can see the turned post here. So all of that would have been made using the same techniques used to make turned legs on furniture. But just notice the truly massive scale and size of this. It was huge, it was heavy, and it definitely would have shown excess riches. So here you can see some Elizabethan chairs. I can't imagine that they would have been that comfortable just because of everything that is digging into your back when you sit on them, but you'll notice that it's not uncommon for them to have a more triangular seat, very similar to what we saw in France with the cockatois chair. However, the arms are much more tight on this one. But the main features to note, and we did see this in the Tudor period, so this is not completely new, but the use of the turned wood throughout. So specifically on the legs here, but you can also see it on the backs of these other two chairs as well. And then this is an Elizabethan coffer, circa 1580. And this would have essentially served as a chest. But you can see the use of the linen fold pattern here, which we've seen before several times. It's continuing to be used during the Elizabethan period. So on this slide, you're seeing two main pieces of furniture. First, on the right-hand side, you are seeing a open shelved cupboard. So this would have been great for storage. It would have been quite large in scale in general, large proportions. So everything is pretty large in comparison to the piece itself, but it would have just held all of the things that you need in your daily life. And then on the left here, what you're looking at is a writing desk. So much like what we've seen before, you would have just been able to fold that down and or write on the surface as it is. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the Jacobean style, which was popularized between 1603 and 1649. So when you're looking at the architecture of this period, you'll notice that there are very few remaining Gothic elements. So Inigo Jones and the banqueting hall in London were taking place during this time, and we will see a revival in the use of classical orders. In terms of the interiors, some elements that you will note are the parge work, which you'll recall we just discussed in the Elizabethan period means that there is a relief of some form on the ceiling. Then you have the wainscot as well as small diamond-shaped windows. Moving on to furniture, you're going to see a lot of melon bulbous forms being popularized within the furniture. The stretchers are going to be placed incredibly low, and we're still going to continue to see the use of the wainscot chair. Ornament is going to be a little bit different, though definitely still recalls some of the former styles that we have discussed. So you have geometric patterns as well as strapwork carvings, including the rinceau. Acanthus leaves, gilly-oche, and palampores are going to once again become popular. Each of these elements you have definitely seen before, but they're going to be revived during this Jacobean period of the early English Renaissance. So on this slide, you see a portrait of James the First. So James the First presides at Hampton Court Conference. And he was actually the King of Scotland, known as James VI, until Queen Elizabeth died, and then he filled in as the role, and through unifying both England and Scotland together, he got the title of King James I. He also ordered that the Bible be translated into English, therefore we get the King James Version of the Bible being instituted. And artistically, he actually continued a lot of elements from the Elizabethan period. So under James, the golden age of Elizabethan literature and drama continued with writers such as Shakespeare, John Donne, and Ben Jonson, as well as Sir Francis Bacon, contributing to a flourishing literary culture. And James himself was a talented writer, authoring works for most of his life. So, like I said, he definitely was a very interesting monarch just because he did have ties to two different nations, and one of the largest aspects of Scottish culture was that it was tied to the Catholic Church, whereas if you'll recall, Queen Elizabeth had made sure that England stayed on the Protestant route. So therefore, he was strongly committed to a peace policy and tried to avoid involvement in religious wars, because he really didn't want to have to take a stance on that. So on this slide, you can see a piece of Jacobean architecture. You'll notice once again that we have stone construction. And you are starting to see some of those orders come back in these pilasters, though not quite like we had seen them before. You still have that projecting window, and then you also have the rounded Roman arch below it. And so here is a better example. You can see all of the use of the different patterning, especially in this little like spiral thing here, as well as the recall of the orders that are being used on this like balcony ledge thing. But once again, this idea of a projecting window is very popular in England, and we haven't seen it really popularized elsewhere in the world. So they are still using a lot of very English elements, but they're also incorporating elements from those former cultures. So here you can see one of those interiors. You'll notice that roof, that or ceiling that, like we said before, has the parge work included. So it has that relief carving carved into it. You still have fireplaces remaining quite important, though this one does not have that Tudor arch that we saw several slides back. And then you can see the use of the turned legs on the furniture as well, and the wall paneling being quite popular. So several different elements here that we have seen before, but they are just continuing to expand and extend into the Jacobean era. And so this one, once again, you can see all of that pattern work with the acanthus leaves and the rinceaux that we have seen before, as well as that idea of an arcade. I know that this one is connected to the wall, but you can see the repeating pattern of the arches. Fireplaces are obviously still quite important at this time period. And this is more of a Tudor arch than we saw previously. It doesn't necessarily come to the same point, but it's a very flattened, rounded arch. And then once again, you can see the use of the former orders being revived and brought into this interior, especially in the columns that surround the fireplace. And so here's just one more example of an interior. Notice how low the stretchers sit on each of these pieces of furniture. They are almost all the way to the ground if they are not sitting on the ground directly. You have the use of the turned leg throughout, as well as the linen fold wall panelings here. You have the ceiling pattern with the relief sculpture cut into it. But the doorways don't have that Tudor arch all the time. You're seeing that rinceaux pattern here as well in all of the moldings. So everything's becoming a bit more detailed with those areas that have been revived. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the banqueting hall. It is largely considered to be the first Renaissance structure in England. It was designed by Inigo Jones, and it has quite a fascinating history. So here you can see a picture of the building. On January 30th, 1649, King Charles I was beheaded on a scaffold in front of the banqueting house of Whitehall Palace in London for raising taxes without due authority and for waging wars against his own people. It was an ironic backdrop for his death, as the banqueting house was created to glorify the reign of him and his father, King James I of England. Designed by the architect Inigo Jones and decorated with paintings by the Baroque painter Peter Paul Rubens, this building symbolized a newly vibrant, lavish, and European-influenced court culture that the two monarchs fostered. During the Jacobean era, Whitehall Palace was the principal royal residence, and the banqueting house was regarded as the presence chamber, where the king would receive visiting ambassadors and hold ceremonies such as masque and state banquets. When the first iteration of the hall burned down in 1619, surveyor Inigo Jones swiftly began to work on the new building. Based loosely on the palace in Vicenza, Italy, Jones's building testified to his understanding of classical architecture as it had been revived in Renaissance Italy. 7 windows wide with 3 central bays, the exterior is a virtuoso exercise in balanced proportion and restrained decoration. The largely rusticated front was originally a mix of Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire, and Portland stone, though the facade we see today was refaced in the early 19th century. The facade is made up of 2 different classical orders, the Iconic order and the Composite order, on successive stories. The 3 central bays are defined by engaged columns, with double pilasters at the end of each story of the facade. The windows of the lower story are capped by alternating triangular and segmental or curved pediments, while there are straight lintels on the windows of the upper story. The only decorative extravagance on the whole facade is the garland frieze of female masks and swags of fruit that runs across the upper story and ties the capitals together, above which stands a balustrade. Following principles set by Palladio and Vitruvius, the interior of the banqueting hall is a single space, a double cube in volume, measuring 110 by 55 feet, and is the height of the two main stories of the exterior of the facade. The interior walls parallel the exterior in their use of classical orders, with superimposed Ionic half columns below and Corinthian pilasters above. Below this room is the basement or undercroft, which housed the king's privy cellar, a rock and shell decorated grotto that was used as a drinking den by James and his favorites. So here you can see an interior view of that banquet hall, as well as the elaborate paintings that were on the ceiling. So they definitely invested quite a bit into the design and art of this specific space. You'll notice that the columns that are being used are those Ionic columns. So they're definitely reviving those historical elements in this style. Here you can see one of those melon bulbous forms, which was popularized on a lot of their furniture, and so we'll see this quite a bit throughout. Here you can see one of the chairs. Notice that the stretchers are incredibly low sitting on the chair. And you still see the use of the turned leg being quite popular, though you see some more relief carving as well, specifically in the back and the area around the back of the chair. So it's not all turned the way that we saw in the Elizabethan period, but we are starting to see a lot more relief carving as well. So some other pieces of furniture to note are going to be this settle here, which is very similar to a chest. You have a tripod-like side table and a cupboard here. So you'll notice that they make use of the scrapwork carving. So the strapwork carving is what you can see that just kind of emulates the straps. Whether that's going in like a band around or just up and down like you see on that top piece. Then you have the split spindles. I don't know that you see an example of that here, but just think this spindle pattern is split. And then you can also see the use of geometric motifs throughout. So here you can really see that Jacobean style. You can see the melon bulbous forms as well as the low stretcher. The acanthus leaves are also used throughout to form some patterning as well as gadroons. So this is a court cupboard. So you'll notice once again all of the strap work carving. That also features a lot of geometric motifs as well as the melon bulbous forms. So now we're going to move on to talking about the Cromwellian period of the early Renaissance, which lasted a relatively short time from 1649 to 1660. This was a period of great unrest due to the ongoing religious wars, and so this led to a lot of artistic and industrial stagnation. The furniture is very rectilinear and simple. It's often made from leather and quite masculine in style, and in terms of ornament, they made the nail heads quite popular. On this slide, you can see a image of Oliver Cromwell, and he is actually not a member of the royal family in Great Britain, but he will imprison Charles I. And he kind of takes in that leadership role, almost as a temporary overthrow of the government. And he does live at Hampton Court. So here you can see a settle here, and you can see the Cromwellian chair here as well, down in this lower corner, kind of tracing it here. And you'll notice that it has a Sadia form, and makes use of those leather and nail head elements that we talked about a couple of slides ago. So there are three main types of seating that are quite popular during this time. You have the Yorkshire chair, the Cromwellian chair, and the form chair. So the form, once again, is very similar to a stool. You'll notice in all of these that they do have low stretchers, though these also have mid-beam stretchers, becoming quite popular as well. They're relatively simple. The Yorkshire chair is very reminiscent of that ladder back look. But the Cromwellian chair has that solid back with then the open element that comes to about halfway. So just keep that in mind as we go through, that this one is a little bit more simplified than some of the other styles that we have seen. But you are still seeing those turned legs as well as nail heads and leather usage, which are elements that we have discussed in the past. So now we're actually stepping away from the early Renaissance into the middle Renaissance, and this is going to start with the Restoration period, which lasts from 1660 to 1689. The rulers that we associate with this period are Charles II and James II, and they will bring the monarchy back into power in England. So where we just had that very short, about 10-year reign of Cromwell, now we're going to be back in that royal family line. This has a lot of French Baroque influence, so it's going to be much more formal than styles that we have previously seen. Renaissance forms remain predominant, so they're going to be what everything is constructed around. We also see Sir Christopher Wren being one of the most influential architects of the time. He is an architect, a math genius, an astronomer, and an Oxford graduate. He will work on St. Paul's Cathedral, that's considered to be his masterpiece, and he will also work on the Hampton Court Palace renovation. We see the use of large wooden wall panels, which we have seen in the past, but they're going to become especially strong here. There are also the use of elaborate carvings, specifically Grinling Gibbon's over mantle treatments. There's going to be a lot of that. We also see the Charles II chair, which utilizes the Flemish scroll, and then they make use of a lot of rich textiles. So here you can see that image of Sir Christopher Wren, and we will look into a lot of his works in a moment, but just keep him in mind that he is the key architect that's going to build St. Paul's Cathedral. And here you can see an image of Charles II, who restores the British monarchy's power over England, so that's going to be the main feature that makes him quite famous. Here you can see an image of a restoration style interior. This is specifically looking at the work of Grinling Gibbons. He was a wood carver and he made a lot of overmantle treatments. So all of this that you're looking at, that would have been his work, and it often mimicked a very classical subject matter. So here are some elements that you can see here. Like we said, it mentions a lot of Baroque influence. You can see that in the spiral legs as well as the herringbone style flooring. And then you can also see the paneled walls, which are more simplified than the linen fold panels that we had seen before. They're much larger scale, but still utilizing that same paneled look that we had seen before. And here you can see an image of Charles II chair, so you can really notice the Flemish scroll in the feet here. The stretchers are now much higher, sitting at that like mid-level height. We're not going to see that across all chairs. The stretcher still moves around quite a bit, but you can see the way that the back of these chairs are, but most importantly is going to be this Flemish scroll leg that you see here. And here is a dining set. Once again, you see some scroll work going on. That's not like a full Flemish scroll, but you're still seeing the nail heads, the leather, some of those other elements, as well as the spiral and spindle turned legs, all of which we have seen before, but now they're just being compiled and used in different manners. All right, so moving right along into the Middle Renaissance, we are going to dive into the William and Mary style, which was popularized between 1689 and 1703. In this time period, you're going to see a ton of Baroque influence. So we were starting to see that in that Restoration style, but now it's going to come back very strongly. This is also when we see the age of walnut rise. So we were going to have a switch from the age of oak to now the age of walnut. However, walnut is quite susceptible to insects, so it is a little bit more delicate to work with in that regard. Marquetry is going to become quite popular, specifically seaweed marquetry. And if you need a reminder on marquetry, the French Baroque is going to be your best place to see that. And then we see a lot of unique leg forms on the furniture. So you're going to see a trumpet, a bell turned, a spiral, and a composite leg, all of which will become quite popular. Then you also see the highboy introduced. So that's going to be an incredibly tall-backed chair. William III is going to be the main leader that we're going to discuss in this time period of the William and Mary style. He was the husband of Mary, and he commissioned Sir Christopher Wren to demolish Henry VIII's lodgings and rebuild Hampton Court. So while we discussed Christopher Wren with the Restoration style, and he definitely was part of that, he is also going to remain quite popular during the William and Mary period. William III will reign alone after Mary's death, but he falls from his horse at Hampton Court and dies in 1702, thus ending his reign. So here you can see a lot of that Gothic influence, specifically in the use of like the trefoils over the arches. You can see the pointed arches as well as all of the spires, the embattlements. Everything is very much Gothic inspired, and so all of those Gothic styles are being revamped into this renovation of Hampton Court Palace. Here you can see a more Renaissance influenced view of Hampton Court Palace, so it does mix the two styles as we discussed early on in this lecture. So you can see here the pediment, which is that simple triangle pediment that was quite popular. All of these different types of pilasters that are being used, and the capitals being used are really harkening back to those traditional elements that we have looked at time and time again. So all of that is being revived and brought into this period, as well as having that really strong Baroque and Gothic influence. So here you can see just how ornamented these chairs are, as well as how high the backs of them are. So they definitely would have been much taller than the average person actually needed them to be. The stretchers are now in that X shape rather than being straight across, and you can see the use of curves throughout. And this is where you're going to see most of that Baroque influence, right? In all of the intricate design work and the curving patterns, as well as just being that like slightly imperfect, heavy ornamentation. So these should not be confused with restoration chairs. If you notice this image, which shows the restoration chairs, they're much more simplified. The backs are not quite as tall, and while they do feature some curves, it is not near to the extreme that the William and Mary style showcases. So here you can see a chest of drawers of some sort. Notice that they still make use of the turned and spindled legs, but you're getting a lot of these other curved pieces that are almost unnecessarily curved, but they're doing that as an extra decorative element. You can see all of the different types of decoration on each of the drawers, very much like we've seen in chinoiserie in the past, though this wasn't necessarily out of the same influence as we had seen before, but you see a lot of that marquetry, and we're going to see that again on the next slide. So here you can see an even better depiction of that seaweed marquetry. And so if you'll recall, marquetry is just the art and craft of applying pieces of a veneer to a structure to form decorative patterns, designs, or pictures. So all of these different pieces would have been made of different materials, laid out and veneered to showcase this. You also see the use of the spiraled leg, which is very much part of the Baroque style. So all of that is coming back into play during this William and Mary period. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Queen Anne period. This one's going to be quite important, especially in terms of the chairs that we're going to see. These are actually still quite popular in traditional homes today, so it's definitely a term I would recommend you know. Following the William and Mary period, this is definitely a much more simplified style. Wrens and Gibbons will continue their work and remain quite popular throughout. You can see the curvilinear influence, which harkens back to the Rococo period quite a bit, especially in the cabriole leg, as well as the pad or club foot. The wood that was used during this time period was mostly walnut, but we also see mahogany making its own statement here. We also see a lot of Oriental influence, so a lot of chinoiserie will become quite popular as well, and the use of wallpaper grows quite a bit. So on this slide, you can see a portrait of Queen Anne. So Anne would become queen after William III died, and politically, Anne's reign was marked by the development of the two-party system, with the Whigs and Tories competing for power. Anne hoped to rule through mixed ministries, but in 1708 the Whigs became dominant. In 1710 there was a shift towards the Tories, which lasted until her death. Anne allowed herself to be heavily influenced by her ministers and her favorites, particularly her friend Sarah Churchill, who was the wife of the Duke of Marlborough. And so here you can just see another image of her. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the most importantly influential pieces of furniture from this time period is the Queen Anne chair. So you'll notice that it has a crest shape to it, as well as a central plait. This one is not going to be pierced, so it's going to be a solid splat in the back. It has a shaped seat, so you can see it kind of curves inward and then outward and back like that. And then it also makes use of the cabriole leg. The early versions of this did include stretchers, but eventually that would be taken out. And most importantly, you can see the use of a pad foot. So this is a Queen Anne chest or writing desk. So you can see that the writing desk part folds out, but it has a significant amount of storage. You can also see some Rococo as well as like formal elements added to it. So you can see this broken curved pediment at the top, but also the shape that we have seen before here that kind of mimics lips, if you'll recall that from our French Rococo lecture. That freeform curve, that is also quite popular here, so a lot of influence is being drawn from that Rococo period. Here you can see a drawing of what that secretary cabinet and writing desk would have looked like had it been closed. So it folds up kind of at an angle, and then that could fold down so that you would have plenty of space to write. You also see that freeform curve up at the top. It wasn't as highly decorated as those during the Rococo period, but you can definitely see a lot of similarities between the two. So here's another example of those chairs. The main thing to note, once again, coming back to those pad feet, in general, these would have had a solid splat in the back as well as being more curved here. But just note the shape of the seat, the shape of the legs. So these also have stretchers, but they also feature that cabriole leg shape, which was quite popular during this time period. And here you can see a tulip vase, and one of the main things to note about this, both in color scheme and imagery depicted, is the use of Eastern forms and motifs to really create a distinctive style. So very much in that fashion of chinoiserie that we have looked at before, those blues and white tones, as well as just the shape of this overall element, would have been quite popular in Eastern cultures at this time period. And since Queen Anne was able to gain a lot of influence from Eastern cultures, we can definitely see that in this tulip vase. So here's an image of Queen Anne's bedchamber. You'll notice, just like in the former periods, we see some wood paneling. This one's very simplified. You've got the tulip vases down here. The bed is still at that hugely monumental scale, but you can see that curved leg here on this little form, as well as the use of a pad foot. So now we're going to move on. We are still in that middle Renaissance, but we're going to be looking at the early Georgian period, which lasted from 1714 to 1750. So this is going to be a very long period, and it encompasses all of George I and a portion of George II's reign. And George I actually never learned the English language. He was actually born in Hanover, Germany, which at the time was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and that is going to have some influence on the way that he interacts with the rest of the world, as well as with his own people, and the design choices that he makes. In general, the style is considered to be very heavy. There's a great tendency towards heaviness. The interior woods used pine and walnut most, but the furniture was exclusively in mahogany. So this is when we are going to consider the age of mahogany to begin. We also see some early Chippendale work in this time period, and that's going to once again be in relation to the furniture. So a lot of the furniture in this time period is going to feature very curvilinear lines. So it's taking that Queen Anne form that we just saw that was quite curvilinear and really expanding on that and adding to it. So more ornamentation is going to be the introduction of pierced splats, as well as the ball and claw feet, and the carving on the knee. And then one of the main people and figures that we're going to look at during this time is William Kent, who served in several roles including architect, landscape architect, painter, and furniture designer. So quite a range of talents that William Kent is known for. So on this slide, you can see the portraits of George I and George II. They will have quite a long reign, especially when added together. All right, so this is obviously a modern reinterpretation. This is not how we would have seen this done. But to give you an idea of that ball and claw foot, that's going to be a great example right here. It's like a claw of a bird that is holding a ball. So it's taking that pad foot that we saw on the Queen Anne chair and adding a lot more detailing to it. But we can still see, obviously, that splayed leg that we're looking at here. So there is definitely still interest in those cabriole and curvilinear forms. So here you can see a side chair and how much added detail it really had, right? So once again, it leans a lot heavier than we had seen with the Queen Anne style. These all seem to have solid slats, but it would not be uncommon during this time period to have additional carving in those and make them pierced slats. But on all of these, no matter how simplified they may look, they are still making use of that cabriole leg and the pad foot, if not the full ball and claw foot. So this is an early Georgian piece of furniture, and you can tell that it is heavily ornate. Definitely has a lot of different parts and pieces going on. You can see this like Greek key pattern, as well as the different like swags of fruit. You can see that Flemish scroll leg, as well as scroll work up near the top. So overall, just note how heavy all of this furniture was. So here you can see a lot of different terms. This is going to be a great way to break down all of your different types of furniture that we have looked at up to this point. So if you want to go ahead and screenshot this slide, I think that that would be a great idea. Here you can see the early Georgian versus the Queen Anne right next to one another. Notice just how much more ornate the early Georgian chair is. You can also see this like armoire or cabinet that is up here, as well as all of the different types of leg and the different types of feet. So like I said, I think this would be a great slide for you to go ahead and screenshot. So now we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail St. Paul's Cathedral. This was built over the span of several years, but some specific dates that we're going to look at are in 1657, 1675, and 1710. It is located in London, and the architect was Sir Christopher Wren. The style is classical Renaissance, and we're going to be able to see that quite clearly. Next slide. So here you're seeing an image of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is an Anglican church in London. It is the seat of the Bishop of London. The cathedral serves as the mother church of the Diocese of London. It sits on Ludgate Hill, which is the highest point in the city of London, and its dedication to Paul the Apostle dates back to the original church on this site, which was founded in 604 CE. The present structure was designed in the English Baroque style by Sir Christopher Wren, and its construction was completed in Wren's lifetime. and was a major building program in the city after the Great Fire of London. So, the earlier Gothic cathedral was largely destroyed in the Great Fire, and it was the central focus of the medieval and modern London, including Paul's Walk and St. Paul's Churchyard being the site of St. Paul's Cross. So, it was such an incredibly important building to the city that they definitely felt the need to rebuild it after that Great Fire of London. The cathedral is one of the most famous and most recognizable sights of London. It's domed, framed by the spires of Wren's city churches, has dominated the skyline for over 300 years. At 365 feet high, it was the tallest building in London from 1710 to 1963, and the dome remains among the highest in the world. And St. Paul's is the second largest church building in the area of the United Kingdom, following only after the Liverpool Cathedral. So, in designing St. Paul's, Christopher Wren had to meet many challenges. He had to create a fitting cathedral to replace the old St. Paul's as a place of worship and as a landmark within the city of London. He had to satisfy the regiments of the church and taste of the royal patrons, as well as respecting the essentially medieval tradition of English church building, which was developed to accommodate the liturgy. Wren was familiar with contemporary Renaissance and Baroque trends in the Italian architecture, and he had visited France, where he had studied the work of Mansart. So we can see a lot of that influence here, definitely within the Renaissance style, right? We see the pediment, we see the use of the orders, but all kind of done in a uniquely English way that can, in some regards, pay homage to the Gothic ideals that had been so popular for this church that had previously stood on this ground. So you are still seeing, like I said, that use of a colonnade, as well as the use of orders throughout. So you are seeing a lot of those Renaissance styles, as well as a lot of the Baroque elements that we have looked at before, especially dating back to the Italian Baroque, as well as the French Baroque to some degree as well. But yes, so just note all of the detail that's being used on the outside of this cathedral, and why it was such an important staple of the city and why it is still a landmark for them today. And as a side note, this is where Charles and Diana got married. All right, so now we're going to move into the Middle Georgian period, which lasted from 1750 to 1770. So this takes up that latter portion of George II's reign, as well as the entirety of George III's reign. And George II is the last monarch to live at Hampton Court. But then we see the rise of George III. In general, in comparison to the early Georgian period, the proportions on this are going to be much lighter. We're not going to see it quite as heavily. The Chippendale style will continue, and we are still very much in the age of mahogany. So all of the furniture is going to be made out of that mahogany wood. And so now we're going to take a look at Thomas Chippendale. He worked in 3 English sub-periods, all of the Georgian ones, so early Georgian, middle Georgian, and late Georgian. He published The Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director, which really specified how furniture should be built. His book enabled other cabinet makers to imitate him, and it's hard to identify a real Chippendale piece, and you must have the original bill of sale in order to claim that it is in fact a true Chippendale piece of furniture. The indication of his talent and marketing ability can be seen in the fact that everyone wants the real deal. So despite the fact that so many were easily able to imitate him because he did publish the book that showed exactly how he made his pieces. Ultimately, it is still far more valuable to find something that was made by his hands. And he really refined the styles that were present at the time rather than creating something that was uniquely new. When working, he always made sure to use the best woods, mahogany mainly, but every now and then he would work with some more exotic woods. And he also used the best methods to make something. So all of the joinery is going to be really high end, very well done. And then he was also a great salesman, as he would have had to be. Like I said, there's nothing that he's really making that is inherently new. It's all ideas of what we have seen before. However, his craftsmanship is really going to set him out above the rest, as well as his ability to sell his product. His forms are generally heavy, though they are a bit lighter as they continue. They're definitely going to be heavy in comparison to some of the other things that we will see later. He often combined many styles, specifically classical styles, as well as the styles of Louis XV. The chinoiserie is still going to be quite popular, and he will be influenced by the Gothic period. There are some gilding, painting, and lacquering going on towards the later end of his lifetime, but it's not necessarily always there and always present on all of his pieces. So of his furniture, his chairs are going to be the most well known, specifically looking at the yoke back chair with the elaborate splat, which we're going to see in a moment. He is also famous for the Chippendale sofa and the use of the marble leg. He also creates a style known as the Chinese Chippendale, which really borrows from French Rococo forms and combines them with Chinese figures and gilding, as well as the use of mirrors. So Chippendale refers to anything that is in his style, not necessarily a piece that's made by him. So especially since he published that book, we refer to anything that anyone has built using his style, using his techniques as Chippendale, though obviously his pieces are still more valuable. So here you can see an image of a Chippendale chair, very similar to what we saw in that early Georgian, though this one is a little bit lighter. You'll notice that like the motif that's here is not as heavy. You still see that pad foot. I think this one might actually be closer to a ball and claw foot. But you can also see some like Gothic inspired elements going on here. You have the like splat back as well as this bowed like side of the back here. So this is an 18th century Georgian chinoiserie lacquered fitted cabinet on a gilt stand. So here you can still see that pad foot, cabriole leg. You can tell by like those extra added motifs that this is in fact part of the Georgian period. And all of the chinoiserie is going to be this that is in the main piece. That's highly decorative, highly lacquered, and it just depicts scenes that would have been popular in China at this time that this is being built. So here you can once again see some middle Georgian chairs. These do not have the pad foot, which is actually quite rare. They also don't have the cabriole leg. Once again, that's a rarity. But one thing that you can really see here are the use of the like pierced splat, right? So it's not solid anymore like we saw with the Queen Anne style. Now we're seeing that being split. Okay, so once again, this is going to be a really great slide to take a time to go ahead and screenshot this. So you can see this Chippendale chair, which has the French influence, this one with the Gothic, and then this one has the ribboned back, and this is a bamboo style stool. You also see the ladder back chair, so just notice the rungs like a ladder. You have the Chinese influence of the chair here. And these are the different styles of chair backs. So this one's very much like a chinoiserie. Then you have the like pierced splat, and here you have a splat that is more solid, though still heavily carved. And here you can see a Middle Georgian interior. You'll notice that they are using a lot more detail than we have seen in other areas, but they're generally using that same Brenso, acanthus sleeve, kind of arabesque styles like we have looked at before. You're not seeing any arches here, which is unique, but you can see the use of the Chippendale chairs in the background here. So this is just another example of the Middle Georgian style. And notice the use of some elements that should recall classicism. So you have these up here in all of the moldings that are very similar to what we would have seen with the entablatures in the past. You've got almost the dental look going on. You've got some other elements there that, like I said, very similar to the moldings that we would have seen in the ancient times. You also see a rounded arch here, as well as just some other elements that, like I said, can be recalled back. You also see this piece of paneling here, which is very much done in the chinoiserie style, so mimicking the style of China. And then you can see that the furniture, though less heavy than what we saw in the early Georgian period, still holds on to a lot of those same elements. You've got the cabriole legs being used throughout, very curved lines, a lot of Baroque and almost leaning Rococo influence here. All right, so a little bit more. We are now fully into the late Renaissance with the late Georgian style, which was popularized between 1770 to 1810. And this lasts through the end of George III's reign. We see a lot of Pompeian and Greek influence, so it's very similar to the French neoclassical style. The Chippendale style is also quite famous, as well as the Hebblewhite, Sheraton, and Adam styles, all of which are going to be really important artists and furniture makers at this time period. And then we have the age of satinwood beginning. So we're finally starting to move away from that mahogany and into the use of satinwood. So looking at George Hepplewhite, he was the lead reaction for delicacy in line. So he wanted everything to be very simplified, very delicate, and he wrote the Cabinet Maker's and Upholsterer's Guide, which his wife would eventually publish after his death. And so he also was the main person to popularize satinwood. So like I said, we're entering that age of satinwood, and George Hepplewhite is going to be one of the first to really make use of it. He used a lot of painted motifs and surface enrichment. And then his construction was generally pretty weak in terms of his furniture. He had very slender proportions and soft wood frames. However, it was quite beautiful and graceful with a lot of color and enrichment. The chair backs had several different shapes, including the oval, shield, camel, heart, and wheel shapes, all of which will become quite popular. So he opted for straight and slender legs as opposed to the cabriole that we had seen become quite famous with the Chippendale style and Queen Anne styles. And then he often used round or square legs that tapered towards the foot. He made great use of the spade foot. We'll see all of this once again in a moment. And he also used marquetry as a form of decoration. He had 5 main back styles: the shield, camel, oval, heart, and wheel. And then he had motifs, so specifically the 3 ostrich feather plume of the Prince of Wales and the wheat blossoms. Some other ornament includes ribbons, fluting, and reeding, as well as vases, festoons, and garlands of leaves, flowers, and fruit. Angelica Kauffman painted classical figures, and sideboards and consoles tended to have a serpentine front. So he wasn't just famous for chairs, he also built some other things. But like I said, this is a great slide to go back to when you need to know what types of ornament was being used. So here you can see a Hepplewhite chair. You can see the shield shape of the back and how simplified this is in comparison to what we were looking at in the early Georgian periods. Note the use of these straight legs that taper downwards towards the feet, as well as these stretchers, which do help hold this up. Remember, satinwood is a very soft wood, especially in comparison to oak and mahogany, so you would have needed those extra supports even more. And then you also see the decorative elements here. These are made with nail heads, but they give you that swag look. So here you can see an oval back, a shield back, and an oval back all right next to one another. And you can tell that they have different forms of decoration inside of those main shapes, but the frame of the chair maintains the same no matter what decorative elements are being used. Obviously, on the left here, you see an armchair, which has very soft and simple arms, and everything is very soft and simple, lightweight in look. And you can see that the legs taper down towards the foot. So here's an oval back chair. This one does have a little bit more decoration to it. It's not just simply straight lines that are holding up that oval, but once again, really straight, square legs that taper as they go downward. Really fine fabrics and finishings on each of these, and you can see some of that decoration, whether that is from the ribbon style or fluting and reeding. All of which can be seen to some extent on these past few chairs that we have looked at. So just note the same patterns of these chairs. You don't need to necessarily know every single element of them, but just know that they have these 2 little support systems essentially that hold up the back of the chair, no matter what shape that back is. So sometimes it's that oval, sometimes it's a shield, or a heart, as well as a camel or wheel style. And this is a Hepplewhite, credenza or chest, kind of like a console table. So you can tell that he used a lot of marquetry here. The veneers are creating a pattern. You can tell how the square legs taper down. That's going to be one of the main features of the Hepplewhite furniture. So just note that it is clean and simple in comparison to what we were seeing in the early Georgian with the Chippendale styles, but still has a lot of decoration to it. So moving on to Thomas Sheraton. He was a preacher, a scholar, and a mathematician, and he published the Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Drawing Book. He made a lot more use of the straight line, specifically looking at the chair backs and chair legs that he would make popular, and the chair back that he was most famous for consisted of 2 horizontal rails with an ornamental splat. So either a vase or a lyre would be quite popular. And if the curve is used, it is segmented, so it's not a full curve of the back. So here you can see that very clearly. You have the two horizontal rails here with some form of decorative splat in between. And so that's the main feature that you need to know about these Sheraton chairs. The legs are quite similar to what we saw with Hepplewhite's. And this is showing you what that could look like in terms of an armchair, but once again, just note the horizontal rails as well as the decorative splat in between the two rails. So some more information about Sheraton. He was the first to use porcelain plaques for design ornamentation. And this would become quite popular even after he was done with his construction of furniture. Much like Hepplewhite, he also used some hand-painted figures of Angelica Kauffman, and he used the same furniture legs as Hepplewhite, so we saw that just a moment ago. He was interested in furniture with secret compartments and secret locks, so we're going to see that especially in his chest and other elements where things could be hidden. He really offered that in all of his pieces as much as he could. And it was a highly imitated look, so everyone really wanted to recreate this style after he had made it popular. The late Sheraton design was influenced by the French Directoire style, so we definitely covered that earlier, so if you want to go back and watch that lecture and be reminded of that style, you'll notice a lot of similarities between the late Sheraton and the French Directoire. It was predominantly designed furniture for bedrooms and dining rooms. We don't necessarily see it much for libraries or elsewhere. And then he also made popular the Pembroke table, which is like a small side table that has the extra folding elements and can be made larger. So here you can see that Pembroke table. Note the same use of the legs that we saw with Hepplewhite. It's a very straight-lined, simple form, but this part here could have been folded out, and there would have been a matching one on the other side, I believe. And that would have made this table large enough that you could like serve a small meal or tea or something like that. So here you can see some more of this furniture. These ones are going to be the Sheraton, and these are going to be much closer to the Hepplewhite style. So we sometimes see these used at the same time in the same place just because they were both part of that late Georgian style, so it's not unusual to see them intermixed like we see them here. Now this goes through the different styles of legs. So you've got the club leg, the dragon claw, the lion paw, and then you have like just the straight leg with a minimal foot, and then this one's tapered and comes back out at a foot. So once again, this is just going to be a great reminder for you as you continue to study these different types of furnishing. And then this is once again just another review sheet that you can go ahead and screenshot. And these are specifically looking at examples of Hepplewhite and Sheraton. So these two here you can see are Hepplewhite with the shield back, and then this one is a Sheraton. So now we're going to move on and talk about Robert Adam and the Adam brothers. So the brothers were John, James, and William. They were architects and furniture makers, and they were often influenced by the discoveries of Pompeii and Herculaneum. So just like we saw in that neoclassical look, we're going to see that reappear here in England. These are very formal in appearance, and like I said, they look quite similar to the French neoclassical style. They designed room in toto, which means that they chose everything so that everything would be coordinated. This was also popular during times such as the French Rococo, where they needed everything to blend together quite well. So they would design the rooms in their totality. Everything was selected from wall finishes to textiles to lighting fixtures, Everything was very well thought out. So Robert Adams specifically did have some trademarks, such as niches with Grecian statuary, large curved wall recesses or large niches, colonnaded enclosure at one end of the room, delicate white or light plaster relief detailing applied to the walls and ceilings, and the motifs, which were generally arabesque rinceaux, vases, dental moldings, honeysuckles, swags, festoons, and garlands. And remember, he was able to use these trademarks, these signatures, time and time again because he would design the room in its totality. So the other piece that would become quite popular is the Adam fireplace, which was made of painted pine, and it often featured classical detailing such as orders, entablatures, and pilasters, as well as a pateray. It was very much in that late Georgian furniture period, which is very similar to the neoclassical style and mimics George Hepplewhite's as well as Thomas Sheraton's style. So here you can see a drawing of a typical Adams fireplace. Note the use of pilasters to hold up the mantle as well as a clear entablature, which you can see kind of here. And then the classical ornament is also quite popular. So you have the festoons, the swags, the pateray, the urn being used as a form of ornament. You also see the wheat drop pendant as well as the arabesque pattern. So all of those we have discussed before, especially looking at the classical styles. So these are nothing new, they're just being revived during this period. So here you can see one of the interiors that the Adams brothers would have created. And you can see kind of over here the Adams fireplace, as well as those signature niches with the Grecian statuary. And then just the use of the ornament throughout. You have like a rinceaux pattern here. And like I said, heavy motif, but very much rooted in the idea of the classical elements, which, like I said, would have been popularized in this time thanks to the rediscovery of Pompeii. So you can see a lot of those elements. They would have built all of this furniture, which you should see has some influence both from those neoclassical styles as well as from his contemporaries such as Hepplewhite and Sheraton. But the most important thing that you'll notice about this room is how everything is tied together, right? Everything is well thought through. He designed everything in its totality. So here you can see an image of the fireplace within the room. You'll notice once again all of those classical elements. Obviously, here's the fireplace. You've got the pilasters, the entablature still present, as well as all of the different forms of classical ornament. In this case, you even have the statuary above it. You see the very classical use of a Roman arch here. So lots and lots of classical influence here, but a very light, bright, airy color scheme going on. So very light plaster work, truly beautiful. And like I said, everything plays so well together because they designed the rooms in totality. And here's just one more example of that. This is a bit more crowded than they obviously would have displayed it at the time, but this is on display in a museum. So like I said, notice the really light, bright, beautiful color schemes that are going on, as well as all of the classical elements that you can see being revived. It is very reminiscent of that neoclassical style, which once again revived the original classical styles. So diving into the late Georgian ornament, we see a lot of pottery by Josiah Wedgwood, and I would imagine that most of y'all are somewhat familiar with Wedgwood pottery. It's that blue pottery that has like white figures on it. We also see a lot of paintings by Angelica Kauffman, who was a Swiss painter and the wife of Robert Adam. She would often paint Italian landscapes, mythical figures, and ruined temples. Um, and then you also see the influence of Delftware from Holland, as well as portraits and sporting subjects. So all of those would become quite popular. We also see vases, mirrors, clocks, and marble and bronze statues and busts become quite popular during this late Georgian period. So here you can see an example of the Wedgwood. Like I said, I would imagine that many of you still recognize this. It's now available in many pastel colors. Generally, we think of it as being blue and white, but it can also be a wide range of pastel colors. And then it is always ornamented with raised classical figures. Wedgwood is still made today. This is actually a modern day example of what you can see, so note the use of pastel colors as well as the raised figures. So moving on into the late Renaissance period, now we're going to be looking at the Regency style, which only lasts about 10 years between 1810 and 1820. So George IV serves as the regent for ill George III. So as George III is dying, his son steps up and becomes the regent over the area. He has a lot of influence from Sir John Sloane and John Nash, as well as neoclassical and empire influence. So very much drawing from the classical and ancient cultures, such as the Egyptian styles, Greek styles, and Roman styles. So once again, nothing we are going to look at here is new. It is simply a revival of things that we have looked at before. This is the decline of English originality. So where we've seen England doing things but interpreting them in their own way in the past, that's going to kind of fall away now. Now we're going to strictly see revivals of former styles, specifically the French Empire style. George IV rules from 1820 to 1830, and he was married. So this is a portrait of George IV, who, like I said, was serving as regent at the time, and in his portrait, he definitely made himself look as powerful as possible. So here you can see one of the pieces of furniture from this Regency period. It definitely has a lot of that empire elements. You're seeing the scrolling work as well as some of these other really just strong, powerful elements. You're seeing a lot of leather work. The nail heads are becoming quite popular. So, like I said, it's a very powerful, very heavy look. And then once again, this is the armchair with caning. So this part here would have actually been caning. And then you can still see the use of like a Flemish scroll, though these are actually going to be figures. So you've got the feet, which is very Egyptian in style, as well as that like composite creature that looks like a lion's face with some wings on it, and the lion feet. So the use of composite creatures, we're drawing back that influence from Egypt. And here are some more pieces of furniture. Once again, you're seeing the like really high curving furniture, but very strong, very stable. And then once again, coming back to like the animal feet as well as some of these curves, you're seeing a lot of influence from those classical styles. So all very, very similar to what we saw in that French Empire style. So Princess Victoria was awoken to be told that she was queen at age 18. She married Prince Albert, and he would eventually die, and she would grieve him for about 40 years while she was still the monarch. She never left Windsor Castle after his death. So she definitely made that space a space that she could feel comfortable in, just because she didn't have anywhere to turn. So they were the first monarchs to live in Buckingham Palace, and here is their portraits. So very elaborate, showing their riches, and going back to the importance of a state portrait. If you'll just recall, we're showing you these every single time just because the state portrait served as a image of the person in charge even when they were not there. So it was very important that your state portrait be incredibly powerful and show your might, despite the fact that you might not be physically in the room at that specific time. All right, so now we're going to dive into the Victorian style specifically, and this really happens during her lifetime, which lasts from 1819 to 1901, and during her reign, which lasted between 1830 and 1901. So she is the second longest reigning monarch, having ruled for 64 years. And this is of England. I believe it is King Louis XV in France, who was the longest reigning monarch ever. But she is the second longest reigning monarch in England, following behind the current queen, Elizabeth II, who beat out Queen Victoria a few years back. She was known for being very prim and proper, and that's going to be seen in her design style as well. And there was quite a bit of industrial growth during the Victorian era. You're going to see that Industrial Revolution really take off, but this did cause the slums around the Thames to develop. There are improvements in housing for factory workers that are still standing, and this was known as Victorian housing, so she did try to make it a little bit better for them, though it definitely wasn't great. And then there's an emphasis on quantity rather than quality, which is something that we will notice as nations turn towards industrialization time and time again. The easier it is to mass produce something, the less quality each piece is going to be. But that does mean that it's also a lot more accessible to a broader group of people. So pros and cons to both, but obviously having quantity really does increase accessibility. Then you see eclecticism. So there's actually going to be a lot of styles mixed together, including the Gothic, Rococo, and Romanesque styles primarily. Everything is very large scale. You have large patterns and clumsy proportions. It's very heavy. And because everything is mixed together, it does come across a little bit like a gingerbread house. So very, very different, not necessarily as sophisticated as we have seen in the past, not as uniform as we have seen in the past, but there's definitely still some merits to it. So, like I said, there's a lot that's clumsy about it, but every now and then, there were some pieces of really great beauty, and so those are the ones we're going to look at. The floral chintzes, which is the type of fabric that's used, they're really going to brighten the drab period. So a lot was happening. Remember that her life, she spent most of it pretty depressed. So that can definitely be seen in all of what is happening in the aesthetics. But the floral patterns are really going to brighten everything and just make it a little bit happier. There was a lot of aesthetic stagnation, so you're going to see this first with William Morris, who was the leader of the revolt, kind of against all of the industrialization. He wasn't really into that. Then you have Charles Eastlake, who really supports the Gothic detailing, and both felt that hand craftsmanship was best. So both Morris and Eastlake are going to take a stance against the Industrial Revolution and be very pro hand craftsmanship and making everything yourself. So in 1838, Queen Victoria ends up opening Hampton Court Palace to the public. Remember that she's living at Buckingham Palace, so this is no longer a residence. So she goes ahead and hands that over to the public so that they can come in and view all of these really beautiful pieces that had been made in the times before her. So here you can see a Victorian chair. As you can tell, it is kind of a hodgepodge of everything that came before it mixed together in a very outlandish way. I mean, you've got like a dog on the arm here, you've got like animal feet that are kind of like a lion's paw, very heavy ornamentation. You've got the curves that we associate with the Rococo and the Baroque. So a lot is going on here. And that's why we say that this is sometimes a very clumsy style, just because there are so many things about it that don't necessarily fit into place, other than just being highly ornamented. And here's what that tends to look like when it's all in an interior. So very crowded, everything's kind of jutting out everywhere. Very opposite of the matching elements that we saw with the Addams brothers, right? They thought of the whole room when they were picking out a piece of furniture, and this Victorian style kind of appears as though you're just throwing as much as you possibly can in a space in it so that you have that ornamentation. So they tried to revive everything all at once, and I don't know that it really worked for them the way that it worked for some other time periods, but this is definitely what the Victorian style was all about. So now we're going to lead into kind of how we see this in modern day Europe, and this is with the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Like I said, she is the current monarch, and she is the longest English monarch to ever serve. She is from the House of Windsor, and she is the oldest daughter of George the Sixth, and he had no sons. So that's why she got to take the throne. Her childhood home was Windsor Castle, and Windsor means winding shore, specifically looking out on that Thames River. And in 1070, William the Conqueror built the Windsor Castle as a defense, so it sits up really high on a hill. It was built in the shape of an 8 and has about 5 miles of corridors within it and 280 rooms. So here you can see a picture of Buckingham Palace and the Victoria Memorial that goes out in front of it. So as you can tell, this memorial to Victoria really showcases everything that her style was, right? It has a lot going on, though it is still very much ordered and a lot more clear than her style traditionally was. And you can see Buckingham Palace in the back with a lot of those neoclassic elements. Okay, so for your review, if you go ahead and download this PowerPoint, which you all should have, there are about 15 slides towards the end here that have different pictures that I think you should go ahead and try to identify them. And all of this will be on your review worksheet as well, but just make sure that you know each of these. So I'm just going to tell you really quickly all of the styles one more time so that you can be reminded. But feel free to go back and scroll through and listen to any part of this lecture if you need any help, or feel free to reach out and email us. But I think it would be beneficial for you to go through these on your own and identify them. So I'm going to let them play for about 5 seconds per slide, but I'm not going to personally go through all of them with you. So just see if you can do your best to identify all of them. And like I said, if not, feel free to reach out. So your styles that you're working with in the early Renaissance, you have the Tudor style, the Elizabethan style, the Jacobean style, and the Cromwellian style. In the middle Renaissance, you have the Restoration, William and Mary, Queen Anne, and early Georgian styles. And then in the late Renaissance, you have the Middle Georgian, the Late Georgian, the Regency styles, and the Victorian styles. So, with that, I hope you have a great rest of your week and good luck with the rest of your module and on your test that is coming up for Unit 3. Like I said, I'm just going to let these review slides kind of play, so please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions at all, but good luck! Alright, so here starts your review, and this is image 1. Image 2, notice the use of the Tudor arch here, that could help. Image 3, notice all of the almost Rococo-like elements as well as a certain style of chair. Here you can actually see a couple of styles mixing, so look at the different types of chairs and see if you can identify those. I think that will be some of the most beneficial things that you can do. These probably look kind of heavy to you, like they could belong in the French Empire style, so that should correlate with one of the styles we looked at today. You've seen these exact pictures before, and they were associated with the style of a queen, not a king. These show the backs of some chairs, and they are a specific style of chair. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that they are in that late Georgian time period, but I think it would be beneficial for you to know what kind, so note the use of the horizontal rails. Alright, so this makes use of some marquetry as well as those strap patterns. Here you can see some really light colors with some white accents, and you'll notice that this room fits really well together. Everything is well planned out. Alright, so notice the type of foot that's on this chair. It's a ball and claw foot, as well as looking at the back. This is a review sheet, so all of the answers are on here, but feel free to screenshot it so that you can learn some more. This is a style of writing desk. And notice that it is pretty simple, but it has a lot of compartments. Once again, this is just a reminder, so just a sheet. It has all of the answers on it. You can see the Elizabethan table and cupboard versus the Jacobean wainscot chair and the Jacobean chair. So like I said, just a great slide to screenshot if need be. Alright, this has several different chairs on it. Note the use of the ball and claw foot as well as the cabriole leg. And this is another review sheet, so go ahead and take a look at that. Alright, and lastly, look at the monumental bed here. Look at the arch that's in the fireplace, as well as all of the detail work that is on the ceiling and in the paneling of the wall. We have looked at this specific room before, so you should be able to find this one fairly easily. And that is all that I have for you today. So once again, great luck on your exam, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.